Ethan Sterling was a man who measured his life in acquisitions and victories. Standing on the balcony of a sprawling Manhattan penthouse, the city lights shimmering below like a sea of diamonds he had personally mined, he felt a familiar, creeping sense of boredom. At 35, he had built an empire, crushed competitors, and dated the most beautiful women in the world. Yet the thrill of the chase was beginning to dull. It was in this moment of restless ennui that his longtime friend and business rival, Ryan, approached him with a glass of champagne and a mischievous glint in his eye. Ryan knew Ethan better than anyone. He knew that the only thing that could truly stir Ethan's blood was a challenge that seemed impossible to win. "You look like a man who has run out of worlds to conquer, Ethan," Ryan remarked, leaning against the marble railing with a smirk. "But I have a wager that might just make your life interesting again." Ethan swirled his drink, raising an eyebrow in mild amusement. "I'm listening, but don't waste my time, Ryan." Ryan chuckled, stepping closer to lower his voice amidst the roar of the party inside. $1 million. But it's not about business. It's about your ego. I bet you don't have the guts to marry a woman who doesn't fit your usual mold. No models, no heiresses. A normal woman. And you have to stay married to her for 6 months. Ethan laughed, a cold, sharp sound that cut through the ambient jazz music. $1 million is pocket change, Ryan. And why would I subject myself to 6 months of mediocrity? Ryan shrugged, playing his ace card. Because you think you can charm anyone, control any situation. But I found someone who I think is immune to the great Ethan Sterling. Her name is Sarah Jenkins. She's ordinary by your standards, but she's distinct. The bet is simple. Marry her. Live with her for 6 months. If you last, you win the pot and the bragging rights. If you walk away, or if she leaves you, I win. Ethan's pride flared. The money was irrelevant, but the insinuation that there was a woman he couldn't handle was a direct insult to his self-image. "Sarah Jenkins," Ethan repeated, testing the name. "Fine. Consider it done. Prepare your checkbook, Ryan." He viewed it as just another transaction, a temporary inconvenience to prove his dominance. He didn't know Sarah. He didn't care about her personality. To him, she was merely an object in a game between powerful men, a variable to be managed and then discarded when the contract expired. Their first meeting took place 3 days later at one of the city's most exclusive restaurants, a place where the silence was heavy with wealth and judgment. Ethan arrived early, seated at a prime table, expecting a nervous, overwhelmed woman who would be dazzled by the surroundings. He had his script ready, the charming billionaire sweeping the ordinary girl off her feet. However, when Sarah Jenkins arrived, she shattered his expectations within seconds. She was not dressed in designer silk, but in a simple, elegant dress that spoke of dignity rather than flashiness. More importantly, she didn't look around the room with awe. She walked straight to his table with a calm, steady stride. She wasn't beautiful in the way Ethan was used to, but there was a striking intensity in her eyes that caught him off guard. She sat down, ignoring the waiter who rushed to pull out her chair, and fixed her gaze directly on him. "You must be Ethan," she said, her voice steady and devoid of the nervous tremors he usually elicited in others. "And you are Sarah," Ethan replied, flashing his practiced, charismatic smile. "I took the liberty of ordering for us." Sarah didn't look at the menu or the expensive wine he had selected. Instead, she leaned forward, resting her hands on the pristine white tablecloth. "Let's skip the performance, shall we?" she said, her tone cutting through his charm like a knife. "I know about the bet, Ethan. I know about Ryan, the money, and the 6-month timeline." Ethan froze, his smile faltering for the first time in years. He had expected to manipulate her, to play a long game of seduction, but she had flipped the board before the first move was even made. "You know," he asked, his voice dropping to a serious register. "And yet, you're here. I assume that means you're interested in the money." Sarah shook her head slightly, a look of distaste crossing her features. "I'm not interested in your money or your lifestyle. I'm here because I have my own reasons for needing a change, for needing space. But I have conditions." She paused, ensuring she had his full attention. "I will agree to this marriage. I will play the part in public. But in private, I am not your wife. I am not your property. You will not control me. You will not dictate where I go or what I think. For 6 months, we share a roof, and that is all. I want my freedom within this cage you've built." Ethan stared at her, genuinely intrigued. He was used to women who wanted his credit card, his status, or his affection. Sarah wanted none of it. She demanded autonomy. It was a novel concept to him, and his arrogance led him to believe that this, too, was a challenge he could overcome. He thought her resistance would crumble under the weight of his luxury eventually. Freedom, Ethan mused, regaining his composure. Very well. You have your terms. 6 months, Sarah, and then we go our separate ways. He extended his hand across the table, not as a lover, but as a business partner closing a deal. Sarah hesitated for a fraction of a second, a shadow passing behind her eyes. Before she gripped his hand firmly, her skin was cool, her grip strong. 6 months, she echoed. As they shook hands, Ethan felt a strange sensation, the unsettling realization that for the first time in his life, he might have just signed a contract he didn't fully understand. The game had begun, but the rules were already changing. Events moved with relentless speed, following their handshake at the restaurant. There was no courtship, no romantic interludes, only the cold precision of lawyers drafting prenuptial agreements. Ethan Sterling treated the days leading up to the wedding like a business acquisition, eager to start the clock on his wager. By the time the actual date arrived, the tone had been set. This was not a union of hearts, but the execution of a deal. The wedding ceremony itself was a masterclass in efficiency, devoid of the chaotic emotions that usually plagued such events. It was a cold, unceremonious affair held in a private judge's chambers, resembling the signing of a high-stakes business merger rather than the union of two souls. Ethan Sterling stood beside Sarah Jenkins, his expression one of polite detachment, viewing the proceedings as merely the first necessary move in his wager with Ryan. He felt a smug sense of victory already. The ring on her finger was, in his mind, a shackle that bound her to his will. Immediately after the papers were signed, Ethan whisked Sarah away to his massive penthouse in the heart of New York City. The residence was a monument to his colossal wealth, a glass-walled fortress in the sky, filled with exclusive art, Italian marble, and furniture that cost more than most people earned in a decade. As the private elevator doors slid open to reveal the panoramic view of the skyline, Ethan watched Sarah closely, expecting the gasp of awe that always came when people entered his world. He waited for the wide-eyed look of gratitude, the realization of just how lucky she was to be plucked from obscurity. But Sarah simply stepped into the foyer, dropped her modest bag on the floor, and walked to the nearest window with a look of utter indifference. "It's a nice view, Ethan," she said, her voice flat. "But remember the terms. 6 months, not a day more." Ethan's smile tightened, his ego prickled by her lack of deference. He convinced himself that she was simply overwhelmed and in denial, needing a push to accept her new reality. In the days that followed, he launched a campaign to reshape her into the perfect trophy wife, believing that material goods were the universal language of submission. He flooded the penthouse with deliveries, racks of designer gowns, boxes of diamond jewelry, and invitations to exclusive galas. He expected her to shed her simple wardrobe and identity, eager to drape herself in the luxury he provided. To his mounting frustration, Sarah refused it all. She left the boxes unopened in the guest room, continuing to wear her own clothes and adhering to her modest daily routine. One evening, Ethan found her reading in the living room, wearing a simple sweater, while a $10,000 dress lay ignored on the sofa nearby. "You're being ridiculous, Sarah," Ethan snapped, pouring himself a drink with aggressive movements. "Any other woman would kill for this lifestyle. Why do you insist on acting like a pauper when you're married to a king?" Sarah didn't even look up from her book. "Because I don't need your costumes, Ethan. I know who I am. You can dress a mannequin, but you can't buy a person's essence." Her defiance ignited a cold fury in him. Ethan Sterling was a man who controlled markets and crushed competitors. He would not be defied in his own home. If sugar wouldn't work, he decided to use the whip. He began to actively sabotage her independence, aiming to force her into reliance. He commanded his assistants to interfere with her schedule, making her wait hours for appointments, or blocking her access to resources she needed for her personal projects. He would dismiss her work as trivial, making cutting remarks over dinner. "You don't need that little job of yours anymore," he said dismissively one night, cutting into his steak. "Your role now is to be my wife, to be available when I need you. Stop pretending your time is as valuable as mine." He manipulated situations to isolate her, cutting off her social contacts and creating obstacles that left her stranded and frustrated. He wanted to see her break, to come to him asking for help, to admit that she needed his power to survive. But Sarah was made of sterner stuff than he had anticipated. She navigated his minefield with a stoic grace, never complaining, never begging, which only infuriated him more. The tension finally reached a boiling point late one rainy Tuesday. Ethan had canceled a meeting Sarah had prepared for, effectively erasing weeks of her hard work with a single phone call. When she confronted him in the study, her eyes were blazing with an intensity that made him pause. "I know what you're doing, Ethan," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "You think if you squeeze hard enough, I'll crumble and become the obedient ornament you want. But you are making a grave mistake." Ethan leaned back in his leather chair, smirking. "I'm just teaching you how the world works, Sarah. Power dictates reality." Sarah stepped closer, placing her hands on his mahogany desk, leaning in until they were face to face. "What do I want? I want respect, Ethan. I am not a pawn on your chessboard, to be moved at your whim. You think you can control me with money and petty games because you're empty inside. You have no concept of dignity." Her words hit him like a physical blow, wiping the smirk from his face. "Money doesn't buy integrity," she continued, her gaze piercing through his facade. "You might think you're the master of this game, but be careful. You're underestimating me. And in the end, the person who loses everything might just be you." She turned and walked out, leaving Ethan alone in his expensive study, haunted by the sudden, chilling suspicion that for the first time in his life, he wasn't the one holding the winning hand. As the weeks turned into months, the atmosphere within the penthouse shifted from a battlefield to a tense, silent standoff that began to wear on Ethan Sterling's psyche. The days went by like a tightly stretched rope, growing more taut with each passing hour, ready to snap at any moment. Ethan, in his lifelong obsession with control, had tried every conceivable method to manipulate the situation to his advantage, to force Sarah Jenkins into the mold of the submissive wife he required to win his bet with Ryan. But Sarah kept resisting without flinching. She was like a fortress he couldn't tear down. Every attempt he made to break her spirit only seemed to reinforce her inner strength. Paradoxically, as his frustration mounted, so did a grudging, reluctant admiration. He started to see Sarah differently. It wasn't just about respecting her resilience. It was something deeper, something that unnerved him. She was doing something no other woman had ever done. She was disarming him emotionally. For the first time, he found himself thinking of her, not as a pawn in a high-stakes wager or an opponent to be crushed, but as a complex person he genuinely wanted to understand. One evening, after a particularly solitary dinner where Sarah had politely ignored him, Ethan found himself alone in the large living room, staring out at the city through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows. The glow of the New York skyline used to give him a sense of omnipotence, a reminder that he sat above the world, untouchable. But now, the view felt cold and empty. He wondered why he was feeling this hollow ache in his chest. Sarah was just a woman he'd married for 6 months. She should have been nothing more than a temporary fixture, a means to an end. But the truth was undeniable. She was stirring something dormant inside him. The man who always controlled his emotions with surgical precision was now being affected by her mere presence. Sarah could see through his facade of wealth and power, and that made him feel dangerously vulnerable. He realized that his old life, the parties, the deals, the superficial adoration, was tasteless compared to the raw reality Sarah represented. Determined to settle the turmoil in his mind, Ethan decided to bridge the gap. He needed to get Sarah out of his head, or perhaps he needed to let her in. When he walked back into the main living area, he found Sarah on the couch, reading a book, completely unaware, or perhaps deliberately ignoring his presence. The silence that had become their norm hung heavy in the air. "Can we talk?" Ethan asked, his voice breaking the quiet. Sarah looked up calmly, marked her page, and gazed at him with a serene but attentive expression. "Of course," she replied, as if she'd been waiting for this moment. Ethan sat across from her, struggling to find the right words. The tension between them was palpable, but he knew he couldn't treat this marriage like a simple formality anymore. "What are we doing here, Sarah?" he asked, a sincerity in his tone that surprised even him. "This started as a game, a bet, but I don't know what to think anymore. The way we are living, this Cold War, it's not enough." Sarah stared at him for a few long seconds, her eyes searching his face as if looking for a trap. When she finally responded, Her voice was calm, but laden with a heavy, cryptic meaning. "I'm not playing, Ethan. I never was." She stood up slowly and walked toward the window, her back to him. I don't care about the money or your control over things. I'm here for something bigger, something you can't buy. And if you haven't realized that by now, maybe it's time to open your eyes." Ethan felt a tightness in his chest, a mix of confusion and a strange fear. It was as if she were holding a secret key to a door he didn't even know existed. "I know you have your secrets, Sarah," he said, standing up and moving closer, frustration bleeding into his voice. "But what irritates me is that the more I try to understand you, the more I realize I'm not in control. And I hate that." "Sarah," she looked up into his eyes, her gaze unwavering. "Ethan," she began, her voice dropping to a low, soft register that sent a shiver down his spine. "This isn't about control. You've lived your whole life trying to dominate everything and everyone, treating people like assets to be managed. But with me, you will have to learn that control isn't always the answer. Sometimes, things just need to be what they are. You can't dictate the outcome of this." Ethan looked at her, and for a fleeting moment, he felt a connection he'd never experienced before. It was terrifying. "So what do you want?" he whispered, his defenses crumbling. Sarah smiled, a mysterious, sad smile that he couldn't decipher. "I want you to figure that out for yourself, Ethan." With that, she walked away towards her bedroom, leaving him standing there in the dim light, alone with his thoughts and the sinking realization that he was no longer the master of his own game. The 6 months were drawing to a close, but for Ethan Sterling, time seemed to have warped into a suffocating loop of anxiety. The looming sense of a revelation he was on the verge of discovering made his stomach turn, a constant nausea born of uncertainty. Sarah Jenkins had become an enigmatic presence in his life, a puzzle he couldn't solve. He thought of her not just as the woman he married on a bet, but as someone who held a mirror up to his soul, revealing cracks he didn't want to see. Consumed by an obsession to understand who she truly was, Ethan had tried to bypass her silence with his usual methods: money and influence. He hired private investigators, the best in the city, to dig into her past, to find the leverage he needed to regain control. He waited for a dossier that would explain everything: a hidden debt, a secret lover, a criminal record. But the reports came back empty. It was as if Sarah Jenkins had materialized out of thin air just to torment him. Her background was clean, almost too clean, leaving Ethan with more questions than answers. Everything seemed carefully orchestrated, as if she were always 2 steps ahead, controlling the game from the very beginning while he flailed in the dark. One night, after a grueling business meeting that felt meaningless compared to the turmoil at home, Ethan arrived at the penthouse later than usual. The apartment was silent, save for the hum of the city outside. The balcony light was on, casting a long shadow across the living room floor. There was Sarah, sitting perfectly still, looking out over the glittering expanse of New York like a queen overseeing an empire she was preparing to burn. Ethan knew, with a sudden, chilling certainty, that tonight was the night the walls would come down. He felt she was finally ready to tell him what he had been so desperate to know. But the fear of what he might hear made his throat tighten. He walked toward her, the sound of his footsteps echoing on the marble, each step heavy with dread. Sarah didn't turn around right away. The air was heavy, charged with the static of an approaching storm. "I need answers, Sarah," Ethan said, his voice firm, though his heart raced against his ribs. "I can't take this game anymore. You have to tell me the truth." Sarah sighed slowly, a sound of infinite weariness, and rose from her chair. When she turned to face him, her eyes, usually calm and calculating, shone with an emotion Ethan couldn't decipher. Something dark, fierce, and incredibly old. "The truth, Ethan." She gave a bitter, humorless smile, crossing her arms over her chest as if holding herself together. "Do you really want the truth?" He nodded without hesitation, though his instinct screamed at him to run. "You have no idea who I am," Sarah began, her voice carrying a chill that dropped the temperature of the room. "You've always seen people as pawns on your chessboard, assets to be acquired or obstacles to be removed. But this time, Ethan, you were the pawn. I've been playing this game from the start." Ethan felt a shiver run down his spine. The certainty he always had about being the master of his universe was crumbling. He tried to speak, to assert dominance, but Sarah didn't let him. "Do you remember the name Jenkins from 5 years ago?" she continued, her voice growing sharper, cutting like glass. "Of course you don't. People like you never remember the small names. My father owned a manufacturing company, a family business he built with his own hands. It struggled to survive, but it was ours. Until you came along. Ethan stepped back, his eyes widening as his mind raced, trying to connect the dots through the haze of hundreds of hostile takeovers he had orchestrated over the years. What are you talking about? He stammered, the confidence draining from his face. Sarah took a step toward him, her eyes burning with a mixture of anger and raw, unhealed pain. My father, Ethan, he was an honest man, struggling to support our family, until you decided his territory would look good in your portfolio. You didn't just buy him out, you destroyed it. You leveraged his debts, cut his supply lines, and forced him into bankruptcy just to acquire the real estate his factory sat on. You ruined him, Ethan. He lost everything. She paused, her voice breaking for a heartbreaking moment as tears welled in her eyes, betraying the steel facade she had maintained for months. My father killed himself because of your empire. Because of your success at any cost, he couldn't live with the shame. The impact of her words hit Ethan like a physical blow to the gut. He stood there frozen, the breath knocked out of him, as memories he had suppressed slowly resurfaced. There had been so many deals, so many contracts signed with a gold pen, so many lives reduced to numbers on a spreadsheet. He couldn't remember every company he crushed to rise to the top. But now, facing the daughter of one of his victims, the ghosts were coming back to haunt him. Sarah, he tried to interrupt, his voice a desperate whisper, but she raised her hand, silencing him. No, she shouted, her anger finally boiling over. You have no idea what you caused. It's not just about money, Ethan. It's about destroyed lives. You took my father from me, the only person I had in the world. While you thrived in this penthouse, my mother and I sank into debt and despair. You lived in luxury, and we barely had enough to eat. Ethan was completely stunned, stripped of his armor. He wanted to defend himself, to say it was just business, but the words died in his throat. All he could do was stand there, staring at her, as the crushing weight of guilt pressed down on his chest. I planned everything, Sarah continued, her tone regaining a terrifying control. When I learned about your bet with Ryan, I saw my chance. I approached the places you frequented. I made sure I was the challenge Ryan would find. I accepted the bet because I wanted you to feel just a fraction of what I felt. I wanted you to know what it's like to be played, manipulated, and left powerless. Ethan felt his body tremble. He had always thought he was the predator, but he had walked willingly into a trap set by a grieving daughter. You destroyed lives without a second thought, she said, stepping closer until she was face to face with him, her eyes searching his soul. And now I'm here not to destroy you financially, but to make sure you never forget what you did. I want you to feel the pain you caused. And that pain, Ethan, will haunt you for the rest of your life. Her revelation reverberated through the penthouse like a death knell, leaving Ethan Sterling standing in the wreckage of his own conscience, realizing he had lost much more than a simple wager. Sarah Jenkins didn't give Ethan time to process the devastation she had unleashed. After dropping the truth about her family's destruction and her father's suicide, she left him alone in the living room, abandoned to his own suffocating guilt. Ethan stood there motionless, the air in the penthouse feeling thick and heavy, as if the very walls of his sanctuary were closing in on him. He wanted to run after her, to apologize, to explain the inexplicable, but his feet were leaden. How could he justify something so cruel? How could he explain that to him it was just business, when to her it was the end of her world? In the days following her revelation, Sarah did exactly what Ethan feared most. She didn't scream, she didn't fight, she simply erased him. Her presence became a constant, haunting reminder of his moral failure. She walked past him as if he were invisible, as if his existence was nothing more than a shadow flickering against the wall. At breakfast, she sat in silence, barely lifting her eyes from her plate. When he tried to speak, his words died in the air, unable to penetrate the fortress of indifference she had built. Ethan, who was used to commanding the room, to being the center of gravity in every interaction, was now being ignored in his own home. The absence of attention was unbearable. Sarah spoke to the staff, handled her personal affairs with a light tone, but with Ethan, the silence was absolute. The weight of this forced isolation was slowly destroying the man he thought he was. Sarah, he tried to call out one morning, as she prepared to leave, his voice cracking with desperation. "We need to talk, please." She stopped, her hand on the doorknob, still facing away from him. The silence in the air grew heavier, and Ethan waited, anxious for some reaction. Any word, even one of anger, would have been better than this void. But Sarah said nothing. She simply opened the door and walked out, leaving Ethan with the echo of the latch clicking shut in his mind. The pain of being ignored by someone he was beginning to see as much more than an adversary was a new kind of torture for Ethan Sterling. He was used to controlling, to winning, but now he was the one being manipulated, punished by silence and disdain. But Sarah didn't stop at silence. She began actively undermining Ethan's confidence in small, painful ways that bled into his professional life. At work, he started noticing that important meetings were being rescheduled without his approval. His business decisions were suddenly being questioned by board members who had previously been loyal, and projects he had initiated mysteriously began to stall. He knew this was Sarah's doing, even if she never admitted it. She had learned his world, his connections, and now she was pulling the invisible strings that held his life together. At home, things were getting worse. Sarah took on a stance of absolute disdain, deliberately distancing herself from any of Ethan's attempts at reconciliation. She stopped sitting with him at meals, avoided any conversation beyond the superficial necessities. When he followed her, trying to fix things, Sarah would respond with cold looks, as if his presence was a foul odor she couldn't escape. One night, Ethan found her in the living room, reading a book. The scene looked peaceful, a deceptive calm before the storm. He sat on the couch, trying once again to breach the wall between them. "Sarah," he began, his voice low, almost pleading, "I know I've done horrible things. I know I've caused you so much pain. But please, can we try to work this out? Can we at least talk?" Sarah slowly closed the book without looking at him. When she finally raised her eyes, her face was so cold that it made him shiver. "Talk," she repeated with a bitter laugh that lacked any humor. "You think there's something left to say? You want words, Ethan. After everything you've done, words are useless." Ethan stood up, moving closer, desperate for any kind of connection. "I was wrong, Sarah. I know that. I would do anything to fix what I've done. I can change, I swear." She finally looked at him, her gaze piercing, challenging him to back up his empty promises. "Change," she said, standing up slowly. "Do you think changing now will erase everything? Will it bring my father back? Will it fix the years my mother and I spent in misery because of your greed?" "No, Ethan, it won't." She stepped closer, and Ethan felt himself sink, crushed by the intensity of her stare. "What you do now isn't for me. It's for you. You want to alleviate your own guilt, but you will carry this weight for the rest of your life." One night, coming home after a disastrous day where a key deal had collapsed, Ethan found Sarah on the phone, laughing softly. He realized she was discussing the rumors about his failing leadership. "You're tearing everything apart, aren't you?" he said, exhausted. Sarah hung up and looked at him impassively. "I'm just giving back what you gave, Ethan. I don't want your money. I want you to watch everything you built crumble and know that it's your fault. I want you to live with the pain, just like I did." Ethan stood in the wreckage of his life, realizing that Sarah's revenge was not about destruction, but about making him feel every ounce of the powerlessness he had once inflicted on her father. Ethan Sterling felt trapped in a maze of guilt and despair, the weight of Sarah Jenkins' revelation pressing down on him like the steel beams of the skyscrapers he built. Sarah had succeeded in making him experience exactly what it was like to be out of control. The weeks following her confession about her father had been unbearable. Ethan, no longer the confident, arrogant titan of industry who believed he held dominion over everything, was now a shadow of his former self. With each attempt to speak with Sarah, he was met with cold stares, ignored, and rejected. Her indifference was eating him alive. He no longer slept, unable to think of anything but trying to fix what he had broken. Yet the magnitude of the truth and the irreversible actions of his past made that path seem almost impossible. However, something began to shift in Ethan's mindset. He realized that his apologies were empty currency. They held no value to a woman who had lost everything because of him. Sarah didn't need words. She needed to see genuine change, real transformation. She needed actions, not promises. One morning, Ethan woke up with a quiet resolve. He knew he couldn't simply demand forgiveness, nor could he buy it. He had to earn it, inch by inch. The first step was to give Sarah the one thing he had always denied her: space. He needed to show her that he respected her autonomy, that he wouldn't pressure her anymore. But he also knew he had to show he was still there, present and caring, in subtle but meaningful ways. Ethan began to pay attention to the microscopic details of Sarah's life, the things he had previously deemed beneath his notice. He observed her daily routines, her preferences, and her silent habits. He didn't stalk her or invade her privacy, but mentally took note of everything she loved. He remembered she had once mentioned peonies and how she missed the smell of her mother's garden. He noted how she took her coffee, strong, black, no sugar. These details, once insignificant to a man focused on million-dollar deals, were now the keys to his redemption. That same afternoon, Ethan went to one of the best florists in the city personally. No assistants, no drivers, and bought a bouquet of fresh pink peonies. He wasn't going to present them to Sarah with a flourish. He knew she'd reject them immediately. Instead, he left the flowers on the kitchen table in a simple vase without a note. It was a gesture stripped of ego. When Sarah returned from a walk, she found the bouquet. She didn't say anything, but Ethan watched from the reflection in the hallway mirror. He saw the exact moment she stopped, her expression softening just a fraction as she leaned in to inhale the scent. She didn't throw them away. It was a small victory, a crack in the ice. In the days that followed, Ethan kept up with these small, consistent gestures. He would wake up early to brew her coffee exactly the way she liked it, leaving the steaming mug on the counter before disappearing into his study so she wouldn't feel forced to interact with him. He left books by her favorite authors on the side table. Slowly, he was trying to show that he was paying attention, that he genuinely wanted to care for her well-being without demanding anything in return. Sarah still kept the wall between them, and Ethan knew breaking through that barrier would take time, but he remained committed. It was on a particularly cold evening that the dynamic truly began to shift. Sarah was on the balcony, wrapped in a blanket, watching the city lights. After hesitating for a few moments, Ethan walked over to her, carrying 2 cups of hot tea. "Here," he said softly, keeping his distance. "I thought you might like something hot before bed." Sarah didn't say anything at first, but she reached out and took the cup, her fingers brushing his for a fleeting second. "Why are you doing this, Ethan?" she asked, her voice soft but firm, finally breaking the silence that had plagued them. Ethan took a deep breath, looking out at the horizon. "Because I realize that talking doesn't mean anything anymore. My words don't matter. But I'm trying to show you that I'm changing. I want to be a better person, not just for you, but because I realized I hate the man I was." "You can't change the past, Ethan," she said, clutching the mug. "I know," he replied sincerely, "but I can change the future." Sarah looked at him, and for the first time, the look of disdain was replaced by a flicker of curiosity. The real test, however, came a few days later. Ethan was dressed in his finest suit, ready to leave for a crucial board meeting that could determine the quarter's profits. As he was checking his tie in the mirror, Sarah walked into the room, looking visibly anxious, an expression he rarely saw on her. She looked at him, then at the door. Can you cancel your meeting?" she asked suddenly. Ethan stared at her, surprised. She had never shown any interest in his schedule. He looked at her, then at his phone, buzzing with messages from his team. Without a second thought, he hit power off and tossed the phone onto the console table. "It's canceled," he said, loosening his tie. "I'm not going anywhere." It was the first time in his life he had put a person before a deal. They sat on the couch, a safe distance between them, but for the first time, the silence didn't feel heavy. "I'm not ready to forgive you," Sarah said quietly, "but you're showing me something different. Maybe that's a start." Ethan felt a surge of hope he hadn't felt in months. He knew the road was long, but as he sat there with Sarah, he knew he was finally walking in the right direction. The weeks that followed that quiet evening of shared understanding were a complex tapestry of tension and fragile hope. For the first time in a long while, Ethan Sterling felt like he was making genuine progress with Sarah Jenkins. She no longer treated him with absolute coldness. The icy wall of silence had begun to thaw, replaced by tentative conversations and shared meals. However, beneath the surface of their newfound civil coexistence, Ethan sensed a lingering hesitation. There was a shadow in Sarah's eyes, a reserved part of her soul that she kept locked away, refusing to let him see. It was a kind of waiting that kept him on edge, an intuitive feeling that the full extent of his past transgressions had not yet been fully laid bare. He knew he was being tested, and while he was ready to face judgment, the unknown gnawed at him. He dedicated himself entirely to proving to Sarah that he was a changed man, canceling work commitments to be present, engaging in the domestic rhythm of the penthouse without his usual arrogance. Yet, despite his best efforts, the distance remained. It was as if Sarah was waiting for the right moment to drop the final weight, to reveal the last piece of the puzzle that kept them apart. Then, on a quiet night, as rain lightly tapped against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, turning the city lights into blurred streaks of gold and red, Ethan noticed a distinct shift in Sarah's behavior. She sat on the couch, staring into the middle distance, looking more introspective and distant than she had in weeks. She seemed lost in a memory so painful that it physically darkened the room. Ethan tried not to push her, respecting the boundaries they had silently established. But his curiosity and concern finally overwhelmed his caution. He needed to know what stood between them. When the silence became unbearable, Ethan broke the barrier. "Sarah," he began, his voice low and laced with a tremor of fear. "I know there's still something between us that you haven't told me. I can feel it." He moved slightly closer, searching her face for a sign. "Please, if there's something you're still holding back, I need to know. I can't fix what I don't understand." Sarah, who had been sitting with her hands tightly folded in her lap, took a deep breath, initially avoiding Ethan's gaze. The silence that followed was agonizing, stretching seconds into hours. But Ethan knew he had to be patient. Forcing her now could undo all the progress he had made. Finally, she turned to look at him, her eyes reflecting a heartbreaking mixture of ancient pain and steely resolve. "You're right, Ethan," she said, her voice soft but heavy with emotion. "I've been holding something back, something I didn't think I could ever say out loud to you. But maybe it's time." Ethan felt the air tighten around him, a premonition of disaster settling in his gut. He leaned forward, bracing himself. "Do you remember the company you destroyed? The one my father managed?" Sarah asked, her tone firm, but her expression crumbling slightly. "I told you that you destroyed our family, and that is true. But that's not all you destroyed." Ethan looked at her, confusion warring with dread. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Sarah lowered her eyes, fighting back tears that threatened to spill over. When she finally spoke again, her voice was a whisper that carried the weight of a scream. "I was pregnant, Ethan, 5 years ago, at the time when everything happened." The words hit Ethan like a crushing physical weight, knocking the air from his lungs. He blinked, his mind reeling, trying to process the enormity of what she had just said. "What?" he whispered, stunned. "I was pregnant," Sarah continued, her eyes fixed on the floor as if watching the scene replay. "And when we lost everything, when my father was gone, the pressure, the stress, the absolute despair of watching my world fall apart, I lost the baby." Ethan felt as though the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. The impact of the revelation was catastrophic. The guilt he had already been feeling, which had consumed him for weeks, now expanded into a black hole of remorse. He had destroyed not just a company, not just a father, but a potential life. "Sarah," he tried to speak, but his voice choked. I did know. I never could have imagined." She finally looked at him, and the tears she'd been holding back streamed down her cheeks. "No, you didn't know," she said, her voice filled with hurt and resentment. "Because you never cared to know. You destroyed lives, Ethan, and you didn't even look at the people in your way. I lost my child because of your ambition." Ethan wanted to vanish. He wanted to rewrite history. "I don't have the words," he finally managed to say, his voice weak and full of despair. "I know what I did is unforgivable. I will never forgive myself for it. But please, Sarah, I would do anything to try and make this right. I will spend the rest of my life trying to pay for this." Sarah watched him for a long moment, seeing the man who was once a titan of industry, now reduced to a broken, pleading soul. She saw the genuine horror in his eyes, a reflection of her own pain. Finally, she took a deep breath, making an internal decision. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Ethan," she said honestly, "but I can see that you are hurting too. I see that you are trying, and maybe there is a chance that one day I can find a way to move forward." It wasn't full forgiveness, but it was an opening. "We'll see," she whispered. And for Ethan, that "we'll see" was a lifeline he promised never to let go of. The days that followed Sarah Jenkins's heartbreaking revelation were transformative for Ethan Sterling. Every word she had spoken about the loss of their unborn child and her father's despair stayed with him, weighing heavily on his conscience. But instead of sinking into a paralyzing abyss of regret, Ethan decided that the pain and guilt would be his fuel for radical change. He didn't just want to win Sarah's love back. He wanted to become a man worthy of her respect and the forgiveness of the many people he had trampled throughout his ruthless career. The morning after their conversation, Ethan made a decision that would alter the course of his life. He wouldn't just stand by, letting the past condemn him forever. He would start over, and the first step was to repair as much of the damage as he could. He began the arduous process of tracking down the families whose livelihoods had been destroyed by his aggressive acquisitions. His first visit was to the family of an old competitor whose business he had ruined years ago, a man who had lost his home because of Ethan's maneuvers. Ethan arrived unannounced, knocking on the door of a modest house in a neighborhood far removed from his ivory tower. The man who answered was a stranger to Ethan, but the look of hardship in his eyes was familiar. "I'm Ethan Sterling," he said, his voice filled with a humility that felt foreign but necessary. "I'm here to apologize." The man stared at him, disbelief warring with anger. "Apologize?" He laughed bitterly. "What's that going to change now?" Ethan didn't flinch. "I can't change the past," he replied firmly, "but I can try to help rebuild the future. I'm here to offer restitution, to help you start again." Over the next few weeks, Ethan continued this journey of redemption. He wasn't writing checks from a distance to assuage his guilt. He was meeting people face to face, listening to their stories, and offering his time, connections, and resources to help them recover. He set up grants for small businesses and recovery programs for those he had displaced. Sarah watched everything from a distance, her skepticism slowly eroding. At first, she remained cautious, observing his behavior like a hawk, waiting for the facade to crack. She knew he was trying, but forgiveness for the loss of a child and a father wouldn't come easily. However, as the days passed, and Ethan showed a consistency she had never seen in him, she began to feel a shift in her own heart. The anger that had fueled her for years was being replaced by a renewed respect. One evening, Sarah was standing on the balcony when Ethan approached her, looking exhausted but at peace. "How was it today?" she asked. Ethan sighed, a sound that carried the weight of his efforts. "Tough," he admitted, "but necessary. Every conversation, every apology, it's a step toward becoming a better person. Not just for you, Sarah, but for me." She turned to look at him, her gaze soft. "I can see that, Ethan," she said, her voice gentle, "and I want you to know that I'm ready to try. Maybe it's time we leave the past behind and build something new." As the 6-month deadline of their contract approached, the dynamic between them had completely transformed. They were no longer adversaries trapped in a game of manipulation. They were two people healing together. When the final day arrived, Ethan prepared a special dinner, not to celebrate the end of the bet, but to mark a new beginning. "Sarah," he said, taking her hand across the table, his nervousness palpable, "I know our agreement is technically over, but I don't want this to end. I've fallen in love with you, truly. I want us to continue, but now as a real couple. No bets, no games." Sarah looked at him, tears shining in her eyes. She realized that despite the pain of the past, she had fallen for the man he had become. "I love you too, Ethan," she whispered. "Let's start over, as equals." Months later, their fresh start brought a miracle that neither had dared to hope for. Sarah began feeling the familiar symptoms she hadn't felt in 5 years. A visit to the doctor confirmed it. She was pregnant. When she told Ethan, his reaction was one of pure, unadulterated joy mixed with tears of relief. It felt as though the universe was granting them a second chance to heal the deepest wound of all. "I want to do this right this time," Ethan said, holding her close. "I want to marry you again. For real." Their second wedding was the antithesis of the first. There were no business associates, no press, just close friends and a celebration of genuine love. As they danced slowly at the reception, Sarah rested her head on Ethan's chest. "Who would have thought it all started with a bet?" she whispered. Ethan smiled, kissing the top of her head. "Who would have thought it'd be the best bet I ever made?" They were ready for the future, proving that even the most broken paths can lead to a beautiful destination. What do you think? Did Sarah make the right choice in forgiving and marrying Ethan after everything that happened? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your opinion on their journey of redemption. Your participation means so much to us. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more narratives like this. Thank you for watching.